Everybody, if you could, welcome to the Institute, the Aspen Institute. This is our new headquarters, and we've done about a year and a half ago. It's great to see a terrific crowd here. We have a number of thought leaders and a number of media members with us today to explore a really important topic. A little bit of background on how this kind of fits within the work of the Institute and our program. The Institute is it's a global nonprofit organization that really specializes in bringing people together to develop shared solutions around the biggest topics of our time. The Sports and Society program is one of about 30 policy programs that focuses on issues related, from higher education to poverty to communications to all sorts of different topics. The program itself, which I am the executive director of, our mission is to convene leaders, facilitate dialogue, and inspire solutions that help sports serve the public interest. Right, so we occupy a unique, place in the sport landscape. We host sport policy discussions. We're one of the few organizations that really thinks about sport policy in a meaningful way. And how can we bring people together and really work through these very difficult but very important topics? The Future of Sports series, which you are a part of today, was launched a year and a half ago. As a way, it's really an act of like looking into the crystal ball and putting a big question on the table. Everything starts with what if. So what if flag football was the standard way of playing the game until high school? What would be the implications on participation, on public health, on high school football? Let's get all the brightest minds up on a panel from diverse perspectives and really think it through. We produced a white paper summarizing those, that conversation and a set of recommendations moving forward. We've also looked at topics such as athlete activism. What if athlete activism was a common occurrence and not just a one-off that we react to, and turns into headlines 10 minutes later? What if the U.S. Olympic movement was rewired to build the base of our system, of our sports system? What if youth coaches were measured not just on how many games they won, by how effectively they're developing the social and emotional skills in kids so they can go on to be effective members of our society. So it's been a really successful series, and I really want to thank the Washington Post for being our media partner in this exercise. Today's question is really focused on the question of what if the federal government developed a national solution to the issues related to NIL. So I imagine everybody in the room now knows what NIL means, name, image, and likeness. You didn't know that 3 years ago because it wasn't that big of an issue, but this is not going away, so lock it in. And NIL is really it's a right to which all of us are born in this country as Americans. We own our name, we own our image, and we own our likeness. And every college student has that right. Every athlete actually has that right, but if you're going to play college sports in this country for the NCAA, you are asked to forego those rights for the period of time that you are playing them. And that's really at the core of the conversation today. What is the fairness around that? How do we move forward and recognize those rights in a manner that also recognizes that college sports has become a $14 billion industry in this country, up from $4 billion in the early 1990s. We actually addressed this issue in an earlier form last year when we asked the question of what if college athletes were able to make money from sponsorships? Would it threaten the future of college sports? Or would it just modernize the institution in the same way that the Olympics were modernized several decades ago when they adjusted their rules around compensation and amateurism? Since our event, much has occurred. In September, California unanimously passed a law, the Fair Pay to Play Act, that in 2023 would make it illegal for California colleges to deny their NCAA athletes the ability to hire agents or receive money from third parties for use of their NIL. Lawmakers in more than a dozen other states are exploring similar proposals, some of which could go into effect as soon as next year. Profiting off your NIL generally means marketing and endorsement opportunities for athletes. Examples could include athletes receiving money from a local car dealership for a commercial, or hosting a sponsored podcast, or becoming a social media influencer, or profiting off of products such as video games and jerseys. What would such a world look like? Well, a lot depends on the legal language, the policy that ends up governing this activity. As Peter Drucker, the management guru, has said quite famously, the best way to predict the future is to create it. That's what's happening right now as states move forward and the NCAA and member institutions deploy lobbyists to hold on to as much control and the current structure as they possibly can, and calls grow for Congress, including by the NCAA, to get involved in this issue. So what does the NCAA want exactly? In our first session today, editorial director John Solomon will explore as much with NCAA President Mark Emmert, who is, we're happy to have him with us again. He was with us a couple of years ago. Our second panel, moderated by Ben Strauss of the Washington Post, features legal analyst Michael McCann, Knight Commission and Intercollegiate Athletics CEO Amy Perko, and Ramogi Huma, president of the the National Collegiate Players Association, and the driving force behind the California bill. And he's also talking to a lot of other state legislatures as well as folks here on Capitol Hill. The third session is focused on what the political environment will allow, right? So Congressman Mark Walker, who introduced bipartisan legislation in the House back in March, that would prohibit the NCAA from keeping athletes from receiving NIL money, will be with us. He might be a little bit late. He's got some duties he's got to finish up on the Hill, but we're hoping he'll show up on time. The event may go over a little bit if we have to, if he is running late. The panel will also feature State Legislator Joe Tate of Michigan, one of the states that has introduced legislation similar to California. And they will be joined by former University of Texas Women's Athletic Director Donna Lopiano, who has talked with a number of U.S. senators and representatives on the topic as well, and I will moderate that concluding session. We encourage you to join the conversation, both in the room and on the live stream, at the following Aspen is Sports and the hashtag Aspen Sports Lab. We'll also take audience Q&A questions in person and from the live stream audience. Please submit them at the address you see there, as.pn/questions. And we will, they'll come into a queue, we will evaluate them, and then we will present a few of those at the end of each of one of the panels. So our first session here, again, Mark Emmert and my colleague, John Solomon, who is not just our editorial director, but many of you know him for his work in the past as one of the top college sports reporters in the country, very adept on these issues, and let's bring up and get it going here. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Tom. Appreciate it. Thanks for being here. So the title of this event is Future of College Sports, but really what we're talking about is happening very much in the present. The NCAA is trying to sort out what's next after spending years and lots of money challenging athlete pay in court. In October, the NCAA voted to permit college athletes to have the opportunity to benefit off name, image, and likeness within the collegiate model. Each of the NCAA's 3 divisions will now take the next year to consider updates to relevant bylaws and policies related to NIL. Our first speaker estimates that he's taken up about 75% of his time these days related to NIL. We're pleased to have with us Mark Emmert, who has served as NCAA president since 2010. Prior to that, Mark was president at the University of Washington and chancellor at Louisiana State University and the University of Connecticut. Today, he oversees an organization that exceeds more than $1 billion in annual revenue as the governing body for about 1,100 universities and nearly 500,000 athletes. Mark, thank you for being here.
Good to be with you. Could I give a shameless plug to Tom and the programs? I just, first of all, it's good to be back at the Aspen Institute, but I'm absolutely delighted by what the Institute's doing with the Sport and Society program. I think you guys are filling a really important niche here, and thanks for doing this sort of convening. I think it can work really, really well. But that was my shameless plug for what you guys are doing. It's really good stuff.
Thank you, appreciate it. I want to start by talking about the NCAA's announcement in October to permit college athletes the opportunity to benefit off NIL. And there have been a lot of headlines saying the NCAA will let college athletes profit off NIL. But that's not really what the NCAA said, so I want to dig into that language a little bit more. The NCAA said athletes could have the opportunity to benefit. So the word opportunity, what does that mean to you in relation to NILs?
Well, first of all, let's go back and talk about this timeline from about the spring, really sometime around this year. I started talking with my board. So let me back up even a little bit further. So one of the most important things for folks to know or remember is that the NCAA is a collection of 1,100 schools. All the rules, all the policies, all the key decisions are made by the schools themselves, not by me, not by a staff member, that those schools, through a representative democracy, come together 4 times a year. So imagine 4 legislative sessions of 3 days each. They come together and they in turn create all their own rules and all their own policies, and through their membership committees then make all the decisions about whether there's going to be sanctions or punishments put in place or anything that's going on. It's all done by those schools. So one of the core notions when the association was founded 115 years ago was that this would be schools self-regulating, schools creating their own structures, schools creating their own rules, schools being in charge of all of the great important decisions that have to be made. So what happened was the Board of Governors, my board, my bosses, 24 university presidents, 5 independent people came together, and we started talking about how would we approach this issue. We agreed to put together a working group representing that cross-section of those 1,100 schools with presidents and students and athletic directors and commissioners and faculty reps all coming together to talk about what could or should happen in this space. They brought forward recommendations to the full Board of Governors, and the Board of Governors in October finally approved of their recommendations. The recommendations were predicated on some fundamental principles. And what the board agreed was that, first and foremost, whatever flexibility was put in place, they wanted to create a framework within which the 3 divisions then could modify their rules. I know this sounds complicated, but it is. It's too complicated, but it's important. So what they said was there's a few key things that we find sort of inviolable in the college sports space. First of all, the relationship between the students and the school has to be that of student and institution, not employee-employer. That student athletes were not employees of the university. The university was not going to be an employer. They weren't going to hire and fire student athletes like employees. Really, really important principle. If you move students into an employee-employer relationship, then that changes their legal context within which they operate. So people often don't think about this. So for example, the most obvious example is Title IX is a component of the Education Act. It has utterly nothing to do with labor law. If you have a labor agreement, just like an employee of the Aspen Institute, you aren't covered by Title IX. So everybody in higher education wants to keep student athletes in a relationship as students, because that's what the base model of college sports is about: students playing students. So they said that clearly. They also said that that any rule changes had to recognize one of the other unique elements of college sports, and that is, unlike the Olympics, they engage in recruitment. The Olympics recruit predominantly by looking at your passport, and what it says, that's your team. In higher education, as everybody here knows, there's these fierce competitions over recruitment and how student athletes make choices. So how can we structure any changes in benefits students receive, money that students might receive, whether it's through NIL or anything else that doesn't blow that model up. And then the third piece is they wanted to make sure that also there was clear recognition of the legal precedent that's been set out there. So there are a number of important legal cases that have been settled. There's some that are still under appeal as we speak. Most of them have been, or the most important ones have been out in the Ninth Circuit, and we have to be consistent with those. Those rulings, the Ninth Circuit has said anything that student athletes receive has to be, their words, not mine, tethered to education. Okay, well, what does that mean, and how does that work, and how does that move forward? And then the very last thing they said was, if we wanted to move into this space, then we need to, well, actually 2 more things. One is we need to let student athletes do as much as possible without getting in the way of these other issues that allows them to be more like regular students. If regular students are doing this, then we need to have a reason to not allow student athletes to do it, not just because they're student athletes. What's the rationale for doing it? And that's got to be clear. And then finally, trying to make sure that there's as much equity across teams and across the campus as could possibly be stirred into this model. So those were the basic, that's the framework within which they then turned to the 3 divisions and said, okay, y'all go out there and make rules. And that's what those 3 divisions are doing now.
So the word benefit, right, you've explicitly not said the word like pay or profit. So could athletes...
I said money.
Okay. Well, in the release, when the NCAA release came out, it just said benefit. So are you open to athletes getting money, direct cash, or are you saying there has to be some kind of benefits tethered to education because of the language?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what's being debated right now. And again, it's being debated in this context of legal decisions that have been, legal precedents that have been established. The member schools certainly don't want to find themselves in disagreement with the judicial system any more than necessary. That's also part of why we're having a discussion with Congress and why the congressional model becomes a really important avenue for this.
Are you personally open to athletes being able to make endorsements, make endorsement money off sponsorships, endorsements in some fashion, if there's some regulation or?
Yeah, if it could be done in a way that's consistent with those principles I just outlined, yeah, sure.
What about bringing the NCAA football video game back? So this is
well. So the video game is a great example, right?
This is the number one question I always get.
Yeah,
from
me
people.
too.
You too as well, right?
When do you get the and it's usually players saying, "When do I get to be in the game?" Because they want to be in the game. I get that. I think that'd be way cool if I was an athlete at that level. That's a really good example. Here's something that we all had to get out of. It generated lawsuits and it wasn't very financially attractive for the schools. Student athletes weren't getting any revenue out of it because technically they weren't in the game. Their avatar was in the game, but not them specifically. That was the point of a lot of the legal debate, whether this was their name, image, and likeness or not. And now if you were going to go back into that world, you'd have to have a number of things in play. You'd have to have legal assurances that you're not immediately going to be sued again around that whole mission, that whole model. You'd have to figure out some way of allocating the resources that would be fair and appropriate to the students who participated in it. So you need some kind of a group licensing model right now that's very hard to put in place without some changes in legal structure or legislative language. And then you'd have to figure out, okay, so what's the representational model for students? How do we make sure that student athletes, whether it's at the campus or the conference or a national level, have an appropriate engagement in that conversation? Because group licenses are typically done in a unionized environment. And how do you do that in a non-unionized, non-employee model? Those things can all be resolved, but they have yet to be resolved.
So you're open to it, because you'll make a lot of fans if you bring it back. You'll bring a lot of fans
I personally am, but of course it's not up to me. It's up to, again, the schools will have to work their way through that. And I think there's ways to do it. Again, it's got to be consistent with those parameters that the Board of Governors and the schools all agreed to.
So let's talk about the state laws. So far, there are about 20 states, by my count, maybe you know different, that have...
I think it's approaching 30. I don't know, somebody may know better than me.
That have introduced NIL bills, or they're going to propose NIL bills in 2020. I know you're strongly against the state-by-state approach. Explain to us why you think it's so unworkable.
Well, because each state the state versions are all slightly different. If you look at, for example, New York's approach is completely different. They want to, in general, they want to take 15% of the gate and put it into a wage fund and do something else with it. I haven't analyzed it. Our legal people are, but it looks pretty much like a pretty traditional pay-for-play model. The California law is obviously vastly different. Some of the other laws that are out there are all slightly different. Some states are saying absolutely not, we're not going to do any of this. Some are racing into it. It depends. And trying to have a fair, balanced model of national championships and having the recruitment landscape look as fair as it can, given all of the disparities that already exist, then having a state-by-state approach just doesn't make any sense. You just really can't figure out how to make all of the relationships between schools, even across a conference, because very few conferences are just single state conferences. There's some, but that implies that you need a federal solution, and that leads us back to Congress too.
So there are a lot of people who agree with you, but let me just play devil's advocate. There are already a lot of benefits that athletes receive that differ between schools. So for instance, the Pac-12, right, at one point had to offer post-college medical care to athletes because of a law passed in California. Then later, some other conferences as well, the Power Five, since it's sort of adopted that. The Big Ten at one point offered multi-year scholarships, said we're going to do 4-year scholarships. Not every conference did that. Cost of attendance stipends are different, across the board, school by school. So just plain devil's advocate, what would make that unmanageable state-by-state approach for NIL?
Well, first of all, all of the things that you mentioned are things that came through and out of the legislative process of those schools sitting down and all agreeing to do just that. They weren't dictates from a state, and they were all based upon this tethered education model, the core principle of what college sports should be about. The model that's being put out, let's just talk about the California model, for example, doesn't have any limitations on it whatsoever. There's no structure around it. There's nothing that indeed it prohibits the association or anybody else from creating rules that would put any constraints on it. So there's nothing that says universities couldn't be deeply involved in that process, that the universities themselves couldn't be out developing sponsorship deals to use in the recruitment process. They encourage the use of agents for high school kids or whatever age. So now under their model, you would have agents representing a youngster who's working a school to find out what kind of sponsorship deal they can line up through their boosters for that athlete to receive. As athletic directors and universities and indeed many student athletes look at that, they say that seems utterly unworkable and unmanageable. The membership of the association is the vast majority are more than happy to find ways to create some of these interesting new opportunities, but they look at that model and say, but that doesn't have doesn't meet any of the kinds of principles that they've already established as essentially guardrails for keeping college sports intact.
And competitive recruiting is what I often hear. The recruiting environment, I think, is what you've talked about.
Sure.
College sports already there's imbalance already as it exists, right? I mean, Clemson and Alabama have won the past 4 national titles. The same dozen or so teams compete for the college football playoff. What evidence is there, do you think, that if you allow athletes to make endorsement money, that it would dramatically make the recruiting environment worse?
Well, first of all, I know everybody loves to talk about the handful of schools that always win, and indeed that's often the case. But if you watch Wofford beat North Carolina 2 nights ago, Carolina probably thinks that there's some pretty good teams out there. The reality is that today there's a incredibly competitive environment around recruiting students. The things, though, the inducements that can be offered to a student athlete don't vary much at all. They're all pretty much the same. They can offer tuition fees, room, board, books and supplies, miscellaneous expense allowance. If the young man or woman's eligible for a Pell Grant, they get that too. And so students today are predominantly making their decisions not based on a financial package, but based upon their fit with that school, whether they want to play for that coach, whether they want to attend that school, whether they think there are opportunities for professional success, whether it's in their sport or in their other professional endeavors. That's the basis on which they're making that decision, not based on whether or not they got a better Chevy dealership from that school versus that school. And I shouldn't say Chevy. Everybody says Chevy. Why don't they say I don't know, Chrysler dealer or some Jeep dealer? But that changes basically everything around the recruitment model. And if you think about schools in major metropolitan areas versus schools in rural areas, all of a sudden or big schools versus small schools, and if this was about who could put together the best sponsorship deal to go on and recruit the next young quarterback, and the school has tucked under their arm 3 car dealership deals or whatever it is, that's for all intents and purposes pay for play, and that they're now paying that young man or young woman to come to their school to play that game.
So the other argument would be there's already money influencing recruits decisions. One is there's money that comes under the table, which we've seen in college.
Well, there's violations. There's certainly violations of rules.
Right, but
can't argue that.
Two, there's a lot of money that goes into the coaches' salaries. There's a lot of money that goes into the facilities, these shiny new facilities, and those are used as enticements for recruits to sign and come. It's going to a different place as opposed to flowing directly to the players. What do you make of that argument? Well,
I think there's two questions there that need to be that shouldn't be conflated, and they often are. And the first is that they may have a shiny new locker room, and I think that there has been an enormous waste of resources on shiny new locker rooms, and young men or young women like those things. They see them as a commitment to the program, and they think, okay, these folks are really committed to building a great basketball program or whatever it is. I think the recruiting impact of that is sometimes exaggerated, but again, that's pretty consistent across the schools that are competing for other students. The difference between whether or not it's a wise thing for a school to spend money on gold-plated locker rooms or not, or whether they're paying coaches or anyone else too much money, that's a completely separate issue. And I could make a strong argument that those resources should be committed to other parts of the university or other elements, rather than used for coaches or other pay. But I think we need to keep those two things as separate issues.
Mm-hmm. So back to the states. We've talked about there's 20 or 30 state laws. How many states have to pass a law before you think you're at the point you need federal help or you need to go to court? Or are you there right now already with California having passed it once?
I just left Senators Romney and Murphy where I said, we need your help right now. Mm-hmm. I think that the debate and the discussion is well past the ability of a group of states to resolve it. I feel very strongly, as do all the universities, that college sports shouldn't be run out of the federal government. And so far I haven't met a legislator that disagrees, but there are people that think that it should be. I think that's absolutely a wrong course to go down. But in terms of addressing these issues and creating a legally valid model in which the schools can provide more than they do now, whatever that might look like, has to be created at a national level, and doing it state by state with, again, potentially 50 different models doesn't make any sense.
So for years, the NCAA has fought against federal intervention. I mean, when I've talked to you,
just 115 years. It hasn't been that long.
The way I always understood it was this was the last resort, going to Congress for federal help. I mean, is that where you are right now? Is this a last resort?
I would never describe it that way, but I think it's an appropriate time, given where we are on this issue. I think also the debate is far too narrowly defined. I listen to the rhetoric of state legislators, for example, and I know we have some here, about what the problems are in college sports today, and then I see the solution as being an NIL bill, and I think those two things don't match up at all. An NIL law like California's, for example, will create doubtlessly some interesting opportunities for the most prominent athletes at a school to monetize their name, image, and likeness and get some sponsorship deals and make perhaps a lot of money. Mm-hmm. And okay, that's fine and dandy, I guess, but I haven't heard most people say that the need around compensation of any kind for student athletes is because the highest profile kids don't have opportunities. They're going to the NBA and the NFL. They are months away from being worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Fine, we can let them make more money if that's where people want to go, but I haven't heard anybody saying that's what really needs to be addressed. I would rather have a debate about what do you want to solve for? What are the real concerns people have here, and how do we solve for those problems rather than just a very narrow focused issue on NIL. It's not because I'm opposed to NIL rights. It's because I don't think that gets what people are really interested in, but I could be wrong.
So what do you want Congress to do? As you talk to them, what message are you sending? Do you want federal legislation, an NIL bill? What would you want in it? Are you seeking an antitrust exemption? And if so, are you trying to protect against future antitrust lawsuits?
You know, the board and I put together a group of university presidents. Had our first meeting yesterday, in fact, to try and craft exactly what that is over this holiday period, going into our national meeting in January. Again, their interest is in trying to create a legal framework to allow student athletes to do more around monetize their name, image, and likeness, consistent with those core principles. It's not going to convert them into employees of the university. They want very much to have a model that protects the integrity of a recruiting process. That probably means that it's not the schools that are out there themselves creating these models and these opportunities, that they're truly organic and coming out of the marketplace, whatever that might look like. They are interested in creating some framework around a group licensing model, whether it's around video games or anything else, that might create some novel solutions to that. And bottom line is that these legal answers to those questions are still in process because they're more complex than we'd all like them to be. But I think they're more than happy to move in those directions and figure out what the role of Congress needs to be to get there. And that's what I've been talking to members of the legislature about, of Congress.
Do you have a sense what interest, if any, President Trump has in signing a bill if it were passed?
I don't.
Has the NCAA reached out to the White House yet? Or
I've talked to some folks there, and you know, they certainly don't seem opposed to the idea. I know they're talking with some members of Congress, both on the House and the Senate side, but I don't know what their particular interest is.
Okay. It's safe to say, I mean, public confidence in the NCAA is kind of low at this point. I mean, you
better than journalism. Just saying.
Ooh, low blow. Geez. Well, so let me cite some internal data that you provided 2 years ago. All right, you said that 79% of the public believe major universities value money ahead of athletes. And you even noted at the time very little things people agree upon 79% of the time, but they agree on that. So I wonder, how concerned are you that the NCAA no longer has the public support to design an NIL solution on your own?
Yeah, well, I'm profoundly concerned about that, and I think all higher ed should be concerned about that question. You know, when I was citing those data, we were talking about what was going on with the Southern District of New York and the basketball scandals, and the fact is that American higher education is a very distinct institution relative to the rest of the world, and that we aren't governed by and run by federal agencies. We don't have a minister of higher education like, you know, Europe and Germany and other places have. I guess Europe and Germany is duplicative, but Germany and England and the rest of the world. So we have relied for centuries now on universities to self-police everything, including their academic integrity. You know, the government doesn't do accreditation visits. University leaders from other universities do accrediting visits. It doesn't matter what it is. Universities rely on each other to make sure that they're behaving in a way that's consistent with higher education values. And when the NCAA was created 115 years ago, it was created in exactly that same model, that other schools would work together, create the rules, create the structure, and then hold each other accountable. And when you see the majority of, or a significant, even if it's just a significant portion of the American public saying we don't have confidence in schools doing that, that's pretty damning critique in my mind. And so that's part of why we added independent board members to our Board of Governors. So we have 5 citizens on our board now. That's part of why we've been trying to communicate more directly on a bunch of these issues around college sports, make sure people know what this is about. I think the citizenry is really wrong when they say that because they're not seeing the breadth of collegiate athletics. But I understand why they say that.
The NCAA has been found to have violated antitrust law twice. You know, in the O'Bannon case, the Alston case, which you're still appealing. So if you're the states and federal government, why should you trust the NCAA to be able to find a fair and uniform solution when you've violated federal law a couple times?
Well, I'm not going to get into a debate about antitrust violations. We feel really good about both of those lawsuits and that they wound up, in fact, in the end, reinforcing the collegiate model as it exists today. And we're not unhappy with where those cases wound up at all, on appeal especially. But I think that, there is a profound lack of trust in institutions in general right now. And I was joking about journalism, but it's not a joke, right? There's no trust in Congress either. So I could easily say, well, why would I go to Congress for a solution? Their approval rating is way below journalism's, right? So until you can generate solutions that people look at and buy into and say, well, that makes some sense, then we've got a very high level of skepticism in every institution in America right now, whether it's Congress, journalism, the presidency, big business, universities, medicine. I mean, pick one. The only one that has reasonable approval ratings right now and confidence levels is the military. And so, you got to work with what where you are and what you can do, and go to the places where you can get solutions. And Congress is where we are right now, where we need to work with. It's a very challenging environment, to say the least. I mean, we're in the middle of an impeachment debate. We're heading into a 2020 election. You would never say, gee, this is the perfect time to try and get Congress to help you. But, this is the time in which we've got to do it, and the context within which we're going to do it.
Yeah. So we're going to open up some audience Q&A that we've done, submitting some questions through as.pn/questions for the rest of the time during the event. And Marty Fox here for Aspen is going to ask the first questions.
Great.
The first question was submitted anonymously. USA Today reported last week that since 2014, at least 33 college athletes have transferred between NCAA schools after being disciplined by a university or in the court of law for sexual offenses. Unlike pro leagues and some college conferences, the NCAA has no specific penalties for athletes found to have committed sexual violence. What will the NCAA do to address this situation, and why hasn't it acted to date?
Yeah, first and foremost, I think it's really important in response to that, any question, is when you hear the NCAA did this or did that, just insert the colleges and universities of America did this or did that. That's who makes those decisions. So it's easy to, when you're saying NCAA, to pretend that that's some amorphous black box. Those are decisions and positions that are taken by American higher education. And so, we have spent an enormous amount of time on the issue of prevention of sexual assault. In fact, the first symposium that was hosted when I got to the association was on that issue. So over the past 9-10 years, we've been working long and hard, trying to get the rest of the American Higher Education Association, by the way, with us, because I think when you look at all the other associations, the steps and approaches that we've taken have been much more direct and assertive than anyone else's. That doesn't mean that it's been enough or it's gone far enough. If we have one of those cases, that's very problematic. But universities have taken quite different approaches to their views on whether or not somebody who's been convicted in the past as a minor, for example, should ever be allowed an opportunity to go to college and participate in college athletics or college behaviors again. And the member schools decided that those were decisions that really needed to be made at the local level by schools themselves as they considered all of the implications of any one case. I think the most disturbing components of that reporting was that it pointed to individuals who had moved into the community college system and then moved back into the four-year school system, and the ability to track that becomes difficult. And some schools, I think, made admissions decisions where they lacked information. But it is something that we are going to be constantly attentive to. I know the board feels very strongly about it, and obviously the member schools want to do everything they can to avoid and prevent sexual assault.
But real quick on follow-up, I mean, there are conference rules. Some conferences, like the Big Sky or the SEC, a couple of them, have these rules of disciplinary measure where you can't transfer within the conference. Is that not possible in the NCAA? I mean, the Big Sky has different states.
Yeah, I think it potentially is, but of course it's also doing it within conference rules. Those schools have all of the rules are different, and all of them are complicated. It's an enormously complex issue when you look at the details of it. And I think it's an issue that's going to routinely be discussed and debated widely, because it's very hard to get to a universal rule that fits all the circumstances, that allows schools to also still make decisions about young men's and young women's lives.
Marty, next question.
This next question was submitted by Sheila Dingus, the editor of Advocacy for Fairness in Sports. Several presidential candidates have stated intent to make education at public universities free. If this occurs, how would you justify the amateurism model, since athletic scholarships to these schools would be obsolete and of no value?
Well, I disagree that they'd be of no value nor obsolete. I think I haven't been tracking on all the presidential debates around free. I assume that means tuition free or without tuition. But if somebody's receiving a full scholarship in an NCAA Division I school right now, and they're receiving all the benefits that are permissible, that student's getting tuition fees, room, board, books and supplies, clothing allowances, miscellaneous expense allowance, travel allowance, medical care, medical support. We send out, we the NCAA distribute another $85 million to all those D1 schools, so that if a young man or woman needs anything from an athletic director, from a computer to a winter coat to anything that they could possibly need as a student athlete, all of those things are paid for. I don't think any of the candidates, no matter what their love of higher ed is proposing anything like that. But most importantly, they're also getting all the support of an athletic department behind them, including all the academic support, all the tutorial support, all the advantages that come along with being a student athlete. So if the tuition component were to be free for all students, I think becoming a scholarship athlete in an American university would still be a very, very attractive proposition.
So I think we have time maybe for one more. Marty?
We have time for one last question. This time from Maddie Salamone, an attorney and former chair of the D1 Student Athlete Advisory Committee.
Great.
Do you personally believe...
What was the student's name? I'm sorry.
Maddie Salamone.
Oh,
Salamone.
sure. Yeah.
Do you personally believe that the NCAA or its member institutions have a moral or ethical duty to take care of their athletes by providing health insurance or coverage for debilitating injuries sustained while playing college sports?
I do, and I think that the model that's in place right now, while we could debate it in any number of dimensions, is quite effective. So all student athletes right now have to have insurance, medical insurance, either provided by the institution or by their family, because most of them, of course, are minors, still covered by their family's insurances in most cases, that covers their medical costs up to $90,000. There's a insurance policy that the NCAA has in place that covers any catastrophic injuries above $90,000 and will cover all the way up to $20 million, pardon me, of medical costs in the event of a really horrible injury. The medical care issue is one that I'm incredibly pleased with the progress we've made over the past decade. Is there more that can be done? Absolutely, and we're constantly going to keep working at that. But the medical care and attention that student athletes receive is actually something that we're very pleased with and proud of. Are there examples, especially from more than 10 years ago, where that wasn't always as good as it should have been? You bet.
Great. Well, listen, that's all the time we have for this session. Really appreciate it. Mark, thank you so much for coming.
My pleasure.
Appreciate it.
Good to be with you all.
Round of applause.
Yep. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks. We're now going to do a brief transition to our next panel, group of college sports experts. I'd like to bring up to the stage now, along with our moderator, Ben Strauss. We're going to do a quick change with the chairs. And Ben Strauss is a sports reporter at the Washington Post. He's also co-author of the book Indentured, The Inside Story of the Rebellion Against the NCAA. Ben?
We're good? Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. Thank you, John. Thank you, Mark. As John noted, I'm Ben Strauss with the Washington Post, and for this college sports expert panel, we have To my left here is Ramogi Huma. He is the executive director of the National College Players Association. He started this work as a UCLA football player in the 1990s when he founded a student group to give college athletes the means to voice their concerns and secure basic protections in college sports. And since the creation of the NCAA, more than 20,000 Division I college athletes from over 150 campuses have joined the organization. To his left, we have Amy Perka. She's the CEO of the Knight Commission since 2016 and the executive director before that. During her time at the commission, the NCAA has adopted a number of its reform-minded recommendations, such as requiring teams to be on track to graduate 50% of their players to be eligible for postseason championships, and revising its revenue distribution to include incentives for academic outcomes. She's also a former college basketball player at Wake Forest. Michael McCann, not a former college athlete.
I wish.
I
played video games in college.
But he is the founding director of the University of New Hampshire Sports and Entertainment Law Institute, one of the nation's leading experts in sports law, and serves as legal analyst for Sports Illustrated. He co-authored the book Court Justice, the inside story of my battle against the NCAA, which chronicled Ed O'Bannon's lawsuit against the NCAA, which introduced, I would imagine, many of us to the term name, image, and likeness, or NIL. So we're up here today, and I think this, today we're talking about NIL and Congress in large part because of what happened in California. And Ramogi, you were pretty instrumental in talking to Nancy Skinner from the very beginning. So I guess, can you tell us why we're here and why California decided to wade into these waters and your conversations with her, and then those continuing conversations with any number of states that are interested?
Sure. First, thanks for having me. My organization was one of the co-sponsors of SB 206, the Fair Pay to Play Act in California. And really, it was kind of a buildup. The first time we attempted legislation was 2003. They attempted something similar, but with less lofty goals, cost of attendance scholarships, the ability to provide health care during summer workouts. And we saw the difficulty going up against the NCAA. If you break NCAA rules, even if the rules are bad, the NCAA can threaten to punish the school. So at the beginning of the year, it was interesting. We knew that issue was going to come up, but decided to be a co-sponsor anyway and continue pushing for change. But what we didn't expect was the reception. And I think a series of events, you mentioned the O'Bannon lawsuit, there's a ton of other issues, from conference realignment showing how really college sports is really interested in a big money grab when it has a chance to, punishing players over the years over frivolous things while ignoring the players who are sexually assaulted, dying in hazardous workouts. I think the public has had more than enough information, and the lawmakers now have had more than enough information to see that the NCAA, and it is the colleges cannot be trusted to do the right thing by college athletes. So it was very interesting to see the bipartisan support, which we've been saying all along, it should be a bipartisan issue.
It was 73
to nothing.
To nothing.
To nothing. No one opposed it. And so, because you're looking at core principles of each party, you're talking about free enterprise and you're talking about equal rights. And it's just kind of really been an amazing year. And we knew that if we can get one state to do it, and we felt like California would be a model state because we'd been up there enough to where they were familiar with our organization and the issues, that we could get it done. And to watch other states line up wasn't a surprise. It's a surprise it's happening so quickly, which we're grateful for. And we are at the center helping states with background information, strategic lobbying information, probably about 12 of the 20 or so, 20 plus states that are engaged now. So it's been an amazing process. I'm also having talks on the Hill. The lawmakers that we've spoken to here in DC that have stepped into the space, by all accounts, are serious, which is a good thing. We didn't know whether or not any of these lawmakers were really trying to intend to keep the status quo in some way, but it doesn't seem like that. So we're very optimistic, between the action on the state level and the federal level.
So let me turn to you, Amy. We heard Mark Emmert just a second ago talk about characterize his conversations with Senator Romney and Senator Murphy as sort of this, we need your help right now. So let me ask you, should Congress be working on this issue? Should they be, quote unquote, helping the NCAA right now?
Yeah. Well, it's first I also want to say thanks for having me, to John and to Tom. It's hard to believe it's, December 17th, 2019, because it feels like Groundhog Day. A lot of us here, a lot of faces I see in the audience have been talking about these issues for a long time. And those who've been involved in it for a long time recognize that we are in a very different place as it relates to the NCAA coming to Congress to say we need your help. And those who follow the history of college sports know that the NCAA was really created because out of kind of a presidential mandate with Teddy Roosevelt saying either clean football up or abolish it. And so a group of presidents decided to get together and begin creating rules to make the sport safer. But since that time, there's been a number of important federal interventions that have helped shape the model we have today. And in most of those cases, the NCAA has said, we don't want that to apply to college sports, or we'll figure it out ourselves. And actually, the organization I work for, the Knight Commission on Intercollegiate Athletics, was really created to try to keep Congress out of fixing college sports and university presidents coming together to say, we need a reform map to really focus on academic reform, improve graduation rates, to show we can make these reforms ourselves. We need to restore the public trust. But I think we are at a point that this issue has spiraled out of the NCAA's control, and moving forward, at least with the NILs, there does need to be some federal legislation to create uniformity. And uniformity is going to be, I think, important to shaping kind of this future model. We also may need federal intervention in the future as it relates to looking at kind of out-of-the-box ideas that others have talked about for a long time, and now you're seeing actually some athletic directors starting to talk about it in terms of legislation that will help control costs, putting in some kind of operational sport operating caps or something that will help preserve all that's good about college sports. But I think we're here, and as Ramogi, kind of said, there was a different reception here recently, because I think in the big picture, everyone knows something is askew here. It's not right. The model's not right. So how can we change the model moving forward?
And Michael, I guess it's sort of hearing Ramogi, the 73-0 vote in California, 20 to 30 states now. Sort of, if you are in support of a changing system and moving forward with different NIL rules for college athletes, you sort of hear the same thing from Mark Emmert. We need your help, Congress. Does it feel like more of a break than it does sort of stepping on the gas for changing college sports if we're talking about Congress getting involved? And sort of, is that, from where you sit, is that something that we want from Congress?
First off, thanks for having me here. And then secondly, I would say it depends on what Congress does, right? I mean, the idea that Congress is involved can be a very healthy thing. Both Ramogi and Amy talked about the potential upside of nationalizing rules, and that if one state does something that other states aren't doing, there's the possibility of a legal challenge that wouldn't exist if the federal government passed a bill and if the president signed it. And the state laws would likely be challenged in court. There are different arguments as to what would happen. The NCAA would argue that a state law violates the Commerce Clause. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution says in so many words, Congress has exclusive authority to regulate commerce between states. And a corollary of that is the Dormant Commerce Clause, which says that one state can't pass a law or regulation that substantially interferes with the commerce of other states. What would happen in a case, it just depends on who you ask. The NCAA would argue that there's favorable precedent for them. There's a Miller v. NCAA case from 1993 in Nevada, and I won't be a law professor, I'm trying not to do that. But very basically, the idea that Nevada, in the wake of the UNLV scandal, passed a law that gave more procedural due process to universities, administrators, and athletes. And the NCAA said, well, if you do that, you are essentially compelling us to pass the same rules for every state. You're essentially hijacking a national entity and changing the commerce in each state. And then there's another case, Partee versus the NFL, San Diego Chargers. It was a former NFL player, very basically. He argued that the NFL's restrictions on competition, the draft, free agency rules, violated state antitrust law in California. And the court said, well, whether or not that's true isn't the question. It's the fact that if we were to say it does, we would be interfering with the commerce of other states. But here's the flip argument. It's not as clear-cut as the NCAA would depict it. Mark Emmert talked about tethered to education, right? That any rule changes have to be tethered to education. The question, and you know, I want to make everyone else can talk. The question is, why does it have to be tethered to education if an athlete signs a deal with Nike? I mean, that's the relationship there is between the athlete and herself and himself and Nike, not with the school. So the idea that that has to be tethered to education, I think, would be argued in court that it's unnecessary. And that, I think, would be a distinguishing factor in favor of the California law and other laws that come up. But it's going to be a really interesting case. I would say these things can take a while. The O'Bannon case, 6-7 years. The Austin case continues. The cases that I referenced took 2 or 3 years. You know, I'm a lawyer. We like to make things go for a long time, right? And that could happen here too. So anyway, it's my long-winded response. Sorry.
So let me come back to you, Ramogi. When I think Mitt Romney first got involved, right, sort of a very big name on Capitol Hill, we need to change college sports, right? That's the top line. And then I think it was on Outside the Lines, he said, you know, we need to have change, but we can't, you know, have athletes driving around in fancy sports cars on campus, which is sort of something, you know, we've heard from folks before. I guess my question for you then is, how confident are you in Congress continuing the work that you're doing on the states or at the state level, or you know, sort of, as Mark Emmert alluded to helping the NCAA, you know, out of a situation where they need a lot of help?
Right. Well, first, we were very supportive of Mitt Romney's comments in terms of wanting to change the NCAA. I mean, he was pretty strong. We're coming after you, NCAA. You've been harming players for far too long. I think that everyone is bringing a different perspective. And I think digesting the issues is coming from, part of that is coming from the perspective that they have. I think that, for instance, that example might be on his mind, but that's why it's important for us to have conversations. I spoke to his office, and I think that we can get people in a common area for the most part. I think, again, the intent is similar, what has been now guaranteed to California athletes. Again, I think it's important, too, that this is no longer, people understand this is no longer a blank slate. There are rights coming to college athletes as a matter of law in a few years. And if you look at, when I say the domino effect, other state lawmakers want to have the same rights. The rights look very similar. Real representation, legal representation, professional representation, the ability to receive third-party money, whether it's tethered to education or not. So I think that our message to Congress is hammering those principles and say, look, states should be free to dictate public policy in their states, higher education, they do that all the time. If Congress is going to get involved, we would like to see a players bill, not an NCAA bill. And there is a very clear line between the two, now that a precedent has been set. If Congress rolls back anything that California has done in terms of representation and no caps on the types of money player can get from third parties, if it begins to roll that back, that's an NCAA bill. It's very clear. And that's something that we'll be opposed to and fight to try to kill and let the states have at it, because the states are the ones driving the change in the first place. If Congress, and we are not opposed to uniformity, it could be a good thing if it's a players bill. So I think it's a conversation, it's an ongoing conversation, and I'm grateful that these offices are allowing us to come in and give our perspective. They've been extremely responsive. There's definitely a lack of information in some of the offices we spoke to, so it can't just be one-sided. The schools, they're a machine. They all have lobbyists, they all have presidents, can pick up a phone and call any lawmaker, invite them to box seats at the game. I'm sure Mark Emmert doesn't have many problems getting meetings up here. For us, it's more difficult. It can be more difficult, but for the time being, we've had, pretty good reception from the various offices. So I think do no harm is what we're looking at. If the federal government is going to roll back rights and protections, we're against it. If they're going to advance them, we're for it.
Amy, the Knight Commission has sort of been an interesting, player in the landscape of college sports. Very out in front on reining in costs and against some of the compensation benefits for athletes. Just yesterday, you guys put out a paper that sort of would like folks to look at the place of FBS football as part of the NCAA umbrella. So I guess I'm sort of curious, would NIL move college sports further away from the system that you'd like to see, sort of a system that has less money in it, that's returned to, or perhaps not returned to, but for the first time, directly focused on education? I guess in the Knights Commission platform, how does NIL fit in?
Yeah, from a big picture, I would start by saying the Knight Commission's purpose has always been to prioritize, to have work for reforms that creates a system that prioritizes education, student athletes' education, their health, safety, and success. And we're not necessarily for taking money out of the system. What we're for is the money being used in the right ways that advance athletes' health, safety, and education and success. So starting with that, and so then what we have said here recently is it's time to really look at the model from a big picture perspective. NIL and the policies with regard to NIL are just a component of that. But again, I think we're here with the name, image, likeness debate really because of the intervention of state lawmakers and federal lawmakers who are looking at the model and saying something's not right about this model, and NIL has a number of attractive reasons to try to address it in that way. What we've said is that today, in 2019, we're existing with a structure that was built in 1970. Divisions 1, 2, and 3, here's the rules for Division 1, here's the rules for Division 2. Think about what's happened on the commerce side since 1970. An entire postseason football has been created from independent bowl games, and now that's consolidated, and the CFPs outside the NCAA, it creates more than $450 million a year that has its own distribution system, again, outside the NCAA. The top 5 conferences have, their revenues have exploded with the conference TV networks, again, the money they're generating from the CFP, and that comes out to about $2.5 billion a year. Again, that's not NCAA created money. The NCAA's March Madness has grown to about $1 billion a year. So I'm saying a lot of billions, and you can see the commerce side has exploded. The structure from the 1970s has stayed relatively the same. And so we're saying it's really time to look at this structure. And can it exist moving forward with football that really impacts the entire landscape, half in and half out? Or do they need to be all in or all out as a sport? And that runs to a lot of, we've talked health and safety questions, should be the most important aspect here. There's some, of course, lots of progress has been made. There's still some things that just kind of an in-the-weeds example, the disability insurance premiums that schools can provide now and pay for any athlete, football athletes, there's a cap on what the schools can spend on that. That's an athlete benefit question. Why is there a cap on that and there's not a cap on coaching salaries? So, those are the kinds of big picture questions. I will say on the NIL question specifically, and the reason I mentioned Groundhog Day is the Knight Commission, we convened a public gathering somewhat like this in 2008. And we had athletes on a panel, and the big question there was video games. Social media actually I'm so old, I organized a meeting when social media didn't exist. So the questions around monetizing social media really weren't the question. Then it was video games, and we asked the athletes, what do you think about video games? And the response was, we love them, we love playing them, but we want a piece of the action. So everybody knows what happened then is the O'Bannon lawsuit was filed, and as Michael said, 7 years later, some of the legal questions are answered, but we still haven't answered the policy question. In 2016, we organized another meeting, commissioned a paper that I would recommend to all of you. It was written by sports law expert Gabe Feldman, and it's very relevant today, and is in fact, I think a model that is being debated. I think the one thing that it brings up, Ramogi, that you kind of, suggested is it going to be a player's model or an NCAA model? You look at Gabe's, in the Knight Commission, we haven't taken a position on any one model yet, and I think, over the next several months, there'll be different models that are out there. But the one thing about Gabe's model that might be a little different, too, than the Drake Group models, he's offered some ideas of how do you regulate this model. And so that's the question, should the model be regulated? And if so, how do you regulate that model, and who's in charge of regulating it? And, I wanted to just that general principle of regulation. A lot of people toss out, well, pro sports, you can have endorsements. Olympic model, you can have endorsements. But in fact, if you look at both of those models, they're highly regulated. Pro sports have salary caps. There's an entire enforcement division within, let's say, each pro league that examines endorsement contracts to make sure there's no manipulation of the salary cap within player endorsements. The Olympic model also has restrictions. So I'll stop there, but I think there's a lot to talk about because I think rules will change, but I think there's several different buckets. Will we see group licensing and no proposal on individual endorsements? Will we see individual endorsements that are non-athletically related, individual endorsements that are athletically related, and the individual endorsements with athletically related ties to it is the one where you have red flashing lights that requires regulation. So I'll stop there with those ideas.
I wanted to ask you, one of the other things that Mark Emmert mentioned with NIL, sort of addressing a problem that various lawmakers see in college sports, and the NIL bills is their prescription. But he said that this is something that's helpful for a very small handful of your top athletes, Heisman Trophy contenders, stars of the Final Four. When we think about group licenses, in addition to individual endorsement contracts, is this a system that sort of would potentially work for everybody? If I know Ramogi's group has talked to the NFLPA about how they might do this, but where you sign a video game deal where everybody playing college football would be able to get a piece of this, even if you weren't a star player.
Yeah, and there's an avenue to get there. It's a trade association, right? The athletes don't have to be employees for them to be eligible to form a trade association. And the trade association could enter into a group licensing deal that provides compensation to everyone. So the idea that it's only a small percent of college athletes would gain from NIL rights, I think is just not correct. And then secondly, it isn't just future NBA players and NFL players. There are a lot of great athletes that are not playing sports that have pro leagues or that don't have full-time pro leagues. And for many of them, their peak earning years in terms of their identity is while they're in school. So, yeah, I know he mentioned I think he mentioned NBA players and NFL players. I would say it's a much broader group of athletes who would benefit, and conceivably all athletes would benefit in some group licensing deals. And I think a trade association could get them there.
And so I guess the follow-up, Amy mentioned this exactly, sort of in 2008, had a very similar conversation. I guess if we're sitting here in 2024, where are we at? Did something change?
Are you asking
That's everybody.
Well, it's interesting. The California bill was heavily debated. The NCAA was essentially threatening California with exclusion and things like that. The California bill in the intent language talked about, we're going to pass this bill and we're going to monitor to see what the NCAA does, because the NCAA was trying to kill the bill with promises that it will actually solve the problem in October. Solve the problem. And as we saw the announcement come and go, the problem has not been solved. Instead, it used it as a placeholder to solicit feedback from 1,100 schools that may or may not feel like putting a proposal together in 2021. And simultaneously, they did talk about threatening legal action, essentially the Dormant Commerce Clause. For one, with Michael, we saw that coming. Actually, some legislation that died on us last year. We actually went with the California State Legislative Council to do a deep dive in the Dormant Commerce Clause. The current language does allow the NCAA to try to make a challenge under the Dormant Commerce Clause, but it'd be a very weak challenge. Number one, the bill, the Nevada bill, the precedent from Miller back in 1993, that was Nevada trying to only regulate the NCAA, nothing within the state. So it was kind of a lopsided regulation. That's a big issue with the Dormant Commerce Clause that does not exist in the California bill and the other subsequent bills, because the other states are saying that not only does the NCAA have to abide by this, but so do our colleges. So there's not that discrimination in interstate commerce the way the Nevada bill was. The Nevada bill focused on 1992 NCAA due process, which arguably was uniform. That's a big issue. There's a couple of tests on the Dormant Commerce Clause violations. Number one, must there be uniformity in order for the industry to exist? Well, the due process, they made the case, they won that. Athlete compensation is all over the place today. And there were other examples that weren't discussed on the previous panel, but the Ivy League players, for instance, make no money. They get no athletic scholarship. While if you're on a 5-year scholarship at Northwestern or Stanford, you're getting over $300,000. That's a huge difference. You have Power 5 conferences who are given explicit authority to make decisions on compensation, where the group of 5 that are left out, they don't have that power. You have the Olympic athletes receiving prize money at Texas. There was a swimmer that received over $750,000 in Olympic prize money. For the NCAA to pretend that there's uniformity now, it wouldn't hold up in court. But might they have standing to at least try and drag things out? That's an issue. But I think one of the things that we're mentioning now and having discussions with at the state level is the idea of taking out the language regarding the NCAA. So what gives the NCAA standing is that the states are saying, well, the NCAA can't punish. Well, they have standing to bring a very weak lawsuit that might drag on. However, if they were to remove that language, they wouldn't quite have the same standing. And the colleges would still have protections under the state. Every state has their own state antitrust laws, meaning if the NCAA were to try to actually follow through and punish apparently now 20 states, which sounds ridiculous, the state antitrust laws would still protect the players. So it is a way to potentially avoid drawn out litigation, take out the language, rely on the state antitrust laws that exist. Mark Emmert mentioned precedent on the federal level, antitrust levels. That does not prohibit states from providing more relief under their state antitrust laws. If you look at, for instance, minimum wage, there's a federal minimum wage. Many states have their own minimum wage. Very similar in antitrust. The federal government might allow the NCAA to essentially keep price fixing is what's going on, even though they lost, which was very shocking. But a state doesn't have to. A state can say, no, in this state here, group licensing, individual licensing, name, image, and likeness, we're going to allow that. And there's not going to be any interference. If there's a monopoly or a cartel trying to interfere with that, that violates our state law. So things are pretty fluid, but I think the NCAA, in my opinion, is making some more missteps, because I think there's a lot of goodwill that's been extended to the NCAA by the state of California legislation, allowed it to act, and it failed to act. And what's also interesting is simultaneously while the NCAA is saying, wait till 2021, you just heard it, they're running up here. They're not waiting until 2021. They're trying to tell the states, hold on and wait for us. But meanwhile, they're going to Congress, trying to get legislation to preempt the state in ways that the NCAA would like. What was also interesting, the conversation with John, when you asked, does that mean, would Mark Emmert personally be against compensation money to the players? And he said, no, so long as it's in line with these parameters. But the parameters he mentioned did exclude money. The collegiate model excludes money. So it's a circular conversation. The NCAA is against what California has done. It's against what every single state lawmaker wants to accomplish in those states. So to come up here and try to undermine that effort, I think I just hope that the members of Congress on both the Senate and the House start to connect the dots. We're doing our best to make sure that they do. But in essence, the NCAA wants the status quo, and they're praying Congress will grant that. And
5 years from now, is there
I think, what's interesting,
a different system? But we got to go to Q&A, so you get a yes or no.
quick. So I just saw a bill signed to protect animals. This is in the middle of impeachment. It's with gridlock we've had throughout different presidents. And I saw that was just signed a little while ago. I think the way everything's lining up, I do think there could be legislation. If it's bipartisan, if it's a players bill, I think it will get through. I don't think it'll be years from now. Call me an optimist, but I think Congress has everything in its power right now to act and bring forth change now.
And then before we get to Q&A, I can give you guys quick yes or no's.
Oh, will we have different?
Yeah.
Yes, I think so.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yes.
All right, questions from the audience. A two-parter, the first part for Michael, second for the full panel. If schools become involved in securing sponsorship opportunities as part of recruiting or athlete retention, would Title IX require equal efforts or equal value for men's and women's sports?
It would certainly be a possibility. And Mark Emmert talked about that model where the school pitches, if you come here, you'll get a deal with a car company. I think the counter argument to that is that it doesn't have to be that way, right? That it could be more organic without being linked to a school. But if a school is involved in providing some kind of benefit, whether it be what you or what the person just described, if you come here you get a deal, or another way that could come up is if a school has some type of oversight check on whether or not a student can sign an endorsement deal. That could also raise the issue of, are they treating male and female athletes similarly? So there is the possibility for Title IX to enter that, but I don't think it's necessary. I think that's a key point. If it's organic and if it's separated from the school, that issue wouldn't be on the table.
And then the broader part of the question, how are non-revenue generating sports protected under an NIL system?
I'd like to jump in on that. First of all, non-revenue sports, there's plenty of players in non-revenue sports that can benefit. We had a panel at UCLA with some athletes on it, and it was interesting. I'd never seen it before, but there was a female track runner who's, they created this media collaboration called Top 5 Media, and they're using their space to interview other athletes. Really cool things. I mean, sports reporters would love that platform, love the access, and they've been putting together, great interviews. Caitlin Ohashi from the gymnast, who had that viral video, they did an interview with her on there, and then you just got to see some of the projects she's working on. She should be able to monetize that. If you have a blog, which Caitlin has, she should be able to monetize that blog. There's plenty of things that non-revenue sports, players from non-revenue sports can engage in. And also the idea, the NCAA likes to say, well, if we allow something like this to happen, the non-revenue sports will go away. That's not true. And the proof is in Division II. Division II has no commercial value in a sense. You don't have the billions of dollars in TV deals. You don't have a $280 million Under Armour deal. And somehow they managed to all field non-revenue sports with scholarships, with coaches, with competitions. So the idea that commercial dollars is what funds all the non-revenue sports is a lie. It's simply a lie. And I'd also point out it's optional. It is not necessary in school-based sports to have big commercial dollars. It's not. It's great. We have no problem with this so long as players have the vehicles and opportunities to also tap into those markets.
I'll just say in response, I do think we'll see a different model. I do not think the model will allow institutions to be involved in setting up endorsement deals, because that will be just another way to have pay for play, and it's not. So we could have another 1 hour debate on that question, but that's my opinion, and I think that's the key to Title IX and those kinds of issues.
And that's, the California legislation it contemplates the athlete going out and getting a deal, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, the agent representing the athlete. I mean, my understanding of it is it's really entrepreneurial. It's the athlete, either himself or herself, or through a group license, going out and doing something. The school is passive in that, right? I mean, that to me, that's, and I know in the conversation between John and Mark Emmert, it was sort of, I think Mark Emmert said that they were, if you come here, you get the deal. that's not what I think the legislation. Ro, maybe you probably.
No, correct. Yeah. No, it's not. And in that scenario, there are still NCAA rules that would punish those schools. That's the thing. You don't have to regulate and put things in law every day. The NCAA is already regulating this market, period. And the California legislation, other state legislation is opening up part of it. But for any school that arranges booster club payments and arranges, they could still be running afoul of NCAA rules, possibly even the law. Many states have laws against that now. So, and whether or not it invokes Title IX, the schools already have to comply with Title IX. It's interesting, for every scandal that there has been, schools paying under the table, really, arguably, should Title IX be invoked, because that school had under the table payments to a male athlete, but not a female athlete. So there's nothing new here. And I think sometimes people get a little bit too paternalistic, and we're a nation of markets, and I think that's been missing in college sports.
Would you be okay with a third-party independent oversight body approving these deals and, not part of the school, not part of the NCAA, but sort of a third-party independent commission that the endorsement deals had to go through and get approved by?
I think it would have to be, I can't answer that right now because I think that process can be hijacked one way or another.
But you're pretty skeptical of that?
Pretty much, because again, there are already laws in place, the NCAA already regulates, various parts of that.
And Amy, you think that's vitally important?
I do think that there will, in a regulated model, there will be a need for oversight. And I think this relates to the bigger issue of NCAA governance in general, and that's something that the Knight Commission, again, we advanced this idea. It went nowhere initially, and then some things changed. Some things happened. The Rice Commission advanced our recommendation that the NCAA should have independent directors on its highest governing board. And that kind of runs to the issue of governance and not just having those who benefit from the system involved in that decision making. And we advocated as well that athletes be added to the NCAA board. And I think Kendall Spencer's in the audience. I think he was the first Student Athlete Advisory Committee chair who was a member of the NCAA board. And we think that needs to be expanded. We think there should be independent directors on the NCAA Division I board, the board that's going to come up with whatever NIL rule, and there should be athletes on that. We think for as long as the college football playoff has its own independent system outside the NCAA, there should be football players on the college football playoff board that has some say in the distribution of $450 million a year. So, to your point, I think there will need to be some type of independent oversight, and it should include athletes, it should include independent directors.
I'll just say that on that, if you look at the other leagues, that's what the players' associations do. They certify the agents. The stewards of the athletes' well-being are the ones that oversee that. Being 5 people, like Mark Emmert said, on the governing board, you got 5 independent people. You got 24 college presidents on that board. If you put 5 athletes on that board, it's not going to tip the scales. And so when it comes to overseeing proper representation, for instance, and some of these things on the player side, that should be a players' organization, not a school organization.
And we didn't say 5. We'd like to see it be more than half, be independent.
And I think we'll leave it there. Thanks, Ramogi. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Michael. Coming up, we'll have Tom Ferry, and he is the executive director of the Aspen Institute Sport and Society program. He previously was a journalist at ESPN, where his work included coverage of NCAA athlete pay issues. So stick around.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yep, perfect, thanks. Perfect.
Right. We're going to put together on this. That's excellent. Let us know any way we can. I was disappointed.
Hey, good job. Yeah. Okay.
questions. We're going to roll through them, and then we're going to dive into the actual conversation.
Hello again.
What's going?
Good to see you today.
Congressman? Good.
Okay, well, thank you, Ben, and thank you really for all the speakers for all the terrific conversation to date. You know, today has already been a huge success, if for no other reason than we got Ramogi, Huma, and Mark Emmert together for a photo. They've been dancing around each other for 25 years, and they actually met in the room, and we memorialized it with a photo. So, you know, the Institute, we take pride in being a nonpartisan organization that, you know, maybe one of the few organizations in D.C. that can bring Republicans and Democrats together around the same table. I think this trumps that. So, thank you. Anyway, listen, we have a terrific panel here, and I'd like to introduce them and then and give you a sense. This is what I would call the politicians panel, even though you're not a politician. Donna, you work in these circles and you have a real sense of what's possible. First of all, Donna Lopiano is the former University of Texas Women's Athletic Director, former Executive Director of the Women's Sports Foundation, President-elect of the Drake Group, a reform-minded organization focused on college sports, and she's an expert in sports policy who is educating Congressman Donna Shalala, talking to a lot of folks on the Hill, and has a real sense of what is possible in this town. Next to her is Mark Walker, Congressman from North Carolina, Republican, introduced the bill back in March, is that right? The Student Athlete Equity Act that proposes to prevent quote-unquote qualified amateur sports organizations from prohibiting or substantially restricting the use of an athlete's name, image, or likeness, and for other purposes. It's a simple 2-page document, you know.
One paragraph.
One paragraph, even. And we'll dig a lot deeper on the key words in there. And third, we have Joe Tate with us, who is a former Michigan State football player and is now a Michigan State lowercase s legislator. He's a member of the House of Representatives, and he has co-authored a bill that would allow college athletes to hire agents and receive NIL money. Michigan is one of course, many states that have introduced bills in the wake of the California bill. And we want to make sure Joe is part of this because even though the focus is on federal solutions to this, the states still do matter in a significant way as we move forward. Who knows if Congress can actually get anything done on this issue moving forward. So we certainly don't want to ignore the voice of the states. So anyway, let's start with recognizing a basic fact here, which is that policymakers are the buyers here, okay? And the NCAA, Ramogi, other folks lobbying on this are the sellers of certain arguments, right? So I'm interested in understanding what you're buying and what you're not buying. And Donna, what do you think legislators you've spoken to are buying and not buying? I'm going to ask a series of questions. Let's try to keep them to yes, no, or multiple choice, select one answer. And then I'm going to ask the audience to weigh in as well with a show of hands on how they feel on these different topics. First one is, do you believe college athletes have a right to profit from their NIL like all other students?
Yes.
100%.
Yes.
Okay. Do you believe that college athletes will be hurt if they can market their NIL?
No.
Negative.
No.
Do you believe access to NIL revenue? Oh, wait, I forgot to ask y'all. All right, let's go back to the first question. Do you believe that college athletes have a right to profit from their NIL like all other students? In favor, raise your hand. Okay. Do you believe that college athletes will be hurt if they can market their NIL? Only a few hands, okay. Do you believe access to NIL revenue will have a negative impact on overall graduation rates of athletes?
No.
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 Room? A negative, do you think it'll hurt? Okay, we'll come back to you at the end maybe. And, all right. Do you believe the ability of athletes to market themselves will make college sports more or less popular with fans?
Neutral. Won't change.
Yeah, I don't think it impacts it at all.
Same.
Okay, so hands in favor of more popular? Less popular? Here we go, one, and neutral. Okay, all right. Do you believe that college athletic departments will make more or less money if athletes can market themselves?
Same.
Yeah, about the same.
More.
More. Why more?
I would say if you're opening up the market for student athletes, I think that there will create additional opportunities, not only for the student athletes, but for the organizations, the institutions, the athletic departments, in my opinion.
Got it. Okay. So, Room, do you believe that college athletic departments will make more money? Raise your hand.
It depends.
It depends. Well, I know. Less money. All right.
Some more, some less.
Okay. You're the complicated one, aren't you? Yeah. Okay.
Because most of them don't make any money now.
That's one we need to unpack, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. Next one is: do you believe women's sports will get less support from universities if athletes are allowed to market themselves?
No.
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 Room, do you believe that women's sports will get less support from universities if athletes are allowed to market themselves? Hands up. Do you believe? Okay, people are not buying that argument. Do you believe that non-revenue sports will get less support from universities if athletes are allowed to market themselves?
No.
No. Apples and oranges.
Okay.
No.
Okay. Room, do you believe that non-revenue sports will get less support? Okay, not a whole lot of support for that. Do you believe there will be more, less, or the same competitive balance among NCAA programs if athletes can receive money for their NIL? More,
Same.
less, or the same?
Same.
Same.
Same. Hands up for more. More competitive balance, less competitive balance. Okay, the same competitive balance. Okay, no big difference. All right, and two more here. Do you believe Congress should develop a national solution to the issue of NILs?
Yes.
It's my bill, yes.
Everybody get to the rationale for that, yeah.
Yes.
You do, even as a state legislator. Why is that?
Well, just for me personally, I come from Big Ten country. So we stretch from Maryland all the way to Nebraska with a variety of states. And I think that there should be some uniform rule. And that being said, and we can discuss later, I think, too, from the state's point of view, we have to stay in front of this as well if Congress doesn't act.
Can I add something real quick on? The reason why it has, in my opinion, to be resolved on a federal issue is if you, and these folks are probably very learned when it comes to recruiting habits. Give you an example. University of Alabama, the Crimson Tide, has a five-star running back named Najee Harris. He's from California. So if California has access to name, image, and likeness, and Alabama or Clemson, South Carolina, or Virginia, you're already creating an unfair recruiting advantage for one school over the other. That's why it has to be done, in my opinion, on a federal standpoint.
Mm-hmm. Got it. So the room, do you believe Congress should be the entity to develop a national solution to the issue of NILs? Yes? No? All right, strong support for that then. And finally, do you think athletes should have a voice in the development of any solution that restricts their rights to market their NIL?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Okay, how about the room? Should athletes have a voice? Ramogi, I know how you're going to vote. All right, strong support for that. Okay, well, thank you. This is really helpful in getting a sense of where people are coming down on these issues here. All right, so
I wish I could do this at every town hall. Get an idea of where they're going.
Right. Yeah, you know what the room is.
Exactly. So.
It's a very favorable room to you, obviously.
Yeah, it seems to be, yes.
Looks like it. So what is the status of your bill, Congressman Walker?
Well, where we are right now, to give you a little history, it was the first bill of its kind, I think either in the House or in the state, any kind of state that came forward with it, that basically is a simple bill that just allows the free markets to be accessible strictly by banning the box, or what I mean by that is where the student athlete would not have to sign the moratorium having any access to their name, image, and likeness as long as they're part of said university. That bill has picked up some steam based on, we got a little bit of it out of the gate. A lot of members of Congress didn't have necessarily an athletic or college sports background, so they didn't really understand why the basis of it. Plus, you had to cut through the propaganda machine of the NCAA, who after the California legislation, if you look at the last statement they put in that, was kind of a misdirection that says, we don't believe the student athletes should be employees of the university. I think that's verbatim the way they said it. Well, Nobody was asking for that. So to cut through some of that, it's really been an education for members of Congress, and we've continued to pick up progress, but especially after the California legislation passed, then everybody started paying attention. It's moving forward. We've got it on hold. I don't have a lot of confidence in this commission that comes April that they will get it done. But if they we're happy to stand down. But if they don't, we're going to go full speed and get across the finish line. And I've got some more comments later in the thing to add as why I think Mr. Emmert chose the path he did in Washington today, refusing to meet with us, going to more of a friendly environment that would have a little bit more of leaning to their side of the issue as opposed to the student athlete.
Can I ask a clarification?
Yeah.
Do you have two bills,
Just
Ways and
one.
Means, or have you converted into
well,
an amendment to the higher education?
Well, it's not been converted to the Higher Education Act. We're working that approach as well, but the main thrust, I know this gets in the weeds and a little wonky here, basically this changes the tax code for amateur status for student athletes. It has to go through the Ways and Means because Ways and Means oversees the IRS federal tax code. Once it goes through Ways and Means rules to the House, the Senate, then passed in law by the President. That's where it's at currently. So yeah, but we have looked at the education route, but the most, I guess the cleanest route is to the Ways and Means Committee.
So you said you requested a meeting with Dr. Emmert today?
Multiple times, not just today. We've been, the last time the NCAA came and met with us, they showed up at our office January, February, and their first comment was to me was, what do you think you're trying to accomplish here? So I said, can I get you any water? And that's kind of been their lobbyist, but we've requested multiple times, and they simply have, he's refused to meet with us. We've met with athletic commissioners like John Swofford of the ACC and other athletic directors who understand the gravity of the issue, but after hearing some of the comments from Mr. Emmert this morning, I don't have a lot of confidence that he really understands the basis of the plight of these families who are trying to, these student athletes who are coming from a different arena. And I think his comments really came across as privilege this morning. I know that sounds pretty harsh, but I'm hoping that he is really interested in resolving this issue as opposed to more of the smoke and mirrors that we've seen in the last few years.
Well, they're taking it seriously. I mean, they've talked to dozens of senators already about this topic. How much confidence do you have that your fellow legislators can understand the issues in a significant and sophisticated way, and B, action can be taken that is roughly similar to what you're proposing? Yeah,
I didn't come from a political background. I've been here 5 years, and I've learned that having meetings, discussing things are just stall tactics in this town, especially when you have all the lobbyist influence that we do. We feel like, and I first got onto this issue about 2 years ago, met with Jay Billis in Charlotte, really was influenced all the way back to the Fab Five, who literally changed the college basketball as we know it today, the long shorts, black socks. Two of those guys get left out in the cold, Jimmy King and Ray Jackson, while everybody else was able to profit. Steve Fisher signed a new multi-million-dollar contract from Sports Illustrated, and that's where I really began to kind of focus. There was an issue. I ran for Congress. This was something that we wanted to resolve. But I have my doubts that the NCAA really has a desire to resolve this. In fact, just months ago, they said they weren't. Then they did 180 degrees. So I'm hoping that they're genuine in their efforts to try to resolve this. I know they're having meetings now, but let's see what happens with it.
But what about Congress? I mean, Congress can't seem to get much done these days. I mean, how can,
we're getting a lot done this week.
Why are we going to have confidence that they can get something done on this issue?
The reason why, because I believe it's a bipartisan support. Here's why. Whether you're looking at this as a civil rights justice issue or whether you're looking at it from a Republican free market issue, they're both the same in the sense as far as it's a win-win. For many of these families, I have a daughter who's at University of North Carolina School of the Arts. If I go see one of her productions or something, the biggest question that we have to figure out is where do we go eat afterwards? For many of these families who are going to go travel and see their son or daughter playing a game, many times it's their son or daughter that's on the front page of the program. Their biggest question is how do we get the gas to get there? And for us not to have an understanding of some of that really shows, I think, an ineptness of understanding the basis of the issue of why having access to your name, image, and likeness is so important. We're not asking the NCAA or the university in our bill to pay a single dollar. We're just saying, as you have every other student, scholarship or not, that has access. If I'm a music scholarship, I can go play in a gig and get paid for it. If I'm an education scholarship or not, I can pick up tutelage and being able to go and earn. It's only the student athlete that we have carved out a specific segment in our society and say, no, you're the only ones in our country that we own you and your likeness while you're at this university. That's a problem that needs to be resolved.
Right. So Donna, I want to get your sense here, on the viability of Congress actually taking real action. We did a prep call the other day with Donna Shalala's staff. She couldn't make it today because of the impeachment issues and so forth. And I thought it was fascinating, even though she's motivated on this issue, she's kind of upset that the NCAA has even said that they're open to the idea of extra benefits related to NIL. So she's almost like to the very opposite place that Mark Walker is. So what do we do with this? People don't like the NCAA, but they're still coming down in different places. So can they actually create something that's going to make sense to everyone?
I have confidence that Congress can do something, but what's amazing, I've visited about 60 offices in the last 4 months. And there are a couple of things that strike me. The unanimity of lack of respect for the NCAA. They understand that the NCAA is not an athlete protection association. It is not a governing organization. It avoids governance whenever it can. What Mark said about all of the, I'm not the NCAA, it's these 1,100 institutions. I'm sorry, the NCAA has refused to protect kids in terms of health and wellness. It refuses to deal with academic fraud. It had a special committee on athlete violence that was, destroyed by the Board of Governors just recently. That line was not a good line. But here's the elephant in the middle of the room. And the reason why they're going to Congress is the NIL bill means the death of the NCAA definition of amateur status.
Right.
And that is what scares them. We're talking about athletes having full and equal rights outside of the institution. Everyone in Congress that I've talked to absolutely understands it. They get it just like that. And the NCAA is really not a respected body anymore. And I think that's going to show in any action. There is bipartisan support for that.
When we first introduced the bill, the very first thing that I did was walk across the complex and meet with my friend Cedric Richmond, former chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, good friend of mine. We are opposing pitchers for most of the time that we've been in the national baseball game. We play at the Washington National Stadium, but we've struck up a friendship. He's a former college athlete, probably the best athlete in Congress if you want to get right down to it, or at least strikes most of us out every year at the baseball game. But we wanted to make sure that no one could, especially the NCAA, could pitch this as this was a partisan perspective. And that's why from the very beginning, we've tried to make sure that this is something that really goes across the aisle. And I think we've had some success. It's just now getting it to the next level.
Gotcha. Joe, what is the minimum that you would want as a state legislator in any kind of federal solution?
I think for us, and the package that myself and my colleague Brant Iden introduced last month is bipartisan. Is very, very similar to California's NIL legislation. So looking at repealing part of the penal code for having student athletes to have some form of agent, and also not allowing an intercollegiate association or an academic institution to restrict student athletes or be penalized for taking advantage of their NIL. I think moving forward, and what I would like to see, and I think what most of my colleagues like to see, as Congressman Walker talked about it, across the board is an issue of fairness. And it's an issue of how do we go about telling student athletes who have worked hard and have done all of the right things to go in and not be able to take advantage of the successes that they've had. So at the end of the day, I'm looking at fairness, leveling that playing field, and how that shapes out. I know it's still being worked on, but at the end of the day, we have to ensure that this is viewed as in the viewpoint of fairness.
Yeah. And are you and Congressman Walker, are you comfortable with putting up any guardrails around that? So for instance, sponsorships related to marijuana or alcohol or tobacco or gambling?
My legislation, I'm a limited government guy. NCAA is a nonprofit. We're not trying to tell you how you need to resolve it. We're just telling you that you need to resolve it. And I feel like that's the federal aspect. Listen, if you want my opinions on something, I'm happy to give them to you, whether you have name, image, and likeness, and maybe you don't wear the school logo that belongs to the school. Maybe you set some guardrails there. But what we're just trying to do is get it across the first step and saying, okay, you no longer can force the student athletes, men or women's sports, to have to sign over their image and likeness to you for you to profit on it, but for them to have no access. How you want to build the system, we want to back off and say what you bring to the table as opposed to telling you exactly piece by piece what you must do.
And I'm more in line with from the last panel. So Amy was talking about some type of oversight function. What that looks like, I certainly agree with that in concept. Obviously, the devil's going to be in the details and how that goes about, but I think there has to be some type of function along those lines. We do it in professional athletics, and I think that's something that...
I don't disagree with that, but I think the NCAA uses that complexity to quagmire, put the whole process in the quagmire, say, well, we've got to work out all these details. That's why I'm saying you can at least take the first step in acknowledging that it's an issue and that we have to resolve it.
And we can still move fast.
Absolutely.
I think, solving these complex issues.
No, I was just saying that whether it's a regulatory body or there's got to be some oversight agency, and the one thing everybody should agree to is that the NCAA should determine what it is.
Exactly.
And it probably should be neither player nor NCAA, but some construct that is a fair arbiter. This is the same situation as our Olympic athletes were faced. They got amateur status struck down in the mid-1970s. They were able to go after their own endorsement contracts. But when there's an intersection between, in their case, Olympics and their own contracts, there was a need for common rules and common oversight to protect each other from pirating. And I think we're on that same train track in terms of college athletics, and there are solutions there. Yeah. But there is a precedent for oversight. Look at what happened when Congress determined that the United States Olympic Committee couldn't deal with sexual misconduct. We set up an independent agency, Safe Sport. We've done that with USADA in terms of doping. Mm-hmm. We have set up independent agencies. This is not government control. We could do this again, and we can do it right.
Mm-hmm. Mark, your bill, the organizations that fall under this bill are quote unquote qualified amateur sports organizations. Does that mean the NCAA only, or could that also mean high schools?
This is specifically a clause code specifically designed for the NCAA, the student athlete, as far as changing that particular status from amateur to something else through the NCAA, for those that are playing some kind of NCAA sports, whatever level it is, it doesn't matter. And remind you of the 450,000 student athletes, nearly 200,000 of these receive no scholarship money, but it applies across the board to all of them.
Mm-hmm. But if you open this up for college athletes, don't you potentially open it for high school athletes too? I mean, LeBron James' kid, he's national news. He's got millions of followers on Instagram.
There are already laws.
Could we basically be...
Doesn't work that way. There are already laws preventing contracts with minors. So now once the student athlete turns 18, that as an adult, if you can go serve on a battlefront in Afghanistan, you should be able to have access wherever you are. But as far as contracting with minors, there are preventions against that under laws, most state laws and federal law.
One more before we go to Q&A here. The NCAA's point of view, at least right now, is their line of stand is that any NIL money should be tethered to education. You're done. Big fan of that one, right? So, but the question is, I want you to, what is going to play on Capitol Hill? Do you think that argument that NIL money needs to be tethered to education will win the day, or do you think they're ultimately going to have to budge off that?
I've seen no inclination on the part of the people I've talked to hold to tethering to education. That is the space that the NCAA is in terms of its compensation model for athletes. Once you get into the free market, it's free market.
Right.
Yeah, the best education in the world to me is being an entrepreneur and starting your own free market, YouTube channel, whatever it might be, that you'll learn real quick what works and what doesn't work.
Right, right. But people do believe in this country, in this idea of being an athlete being more than just an athlete. You are playing sports so you can develop as a human being, academically, socially, emotionally, and otherwise. So, I mean, this goes back 100 years, this affection that we have with what is now called the student-athlete concept. I mean, so you're saying you don't think this idea of tethering this money will play with the legislators who are going to vote on this?
What concerns me is who makes that call, whether it's tethered or not. That's the problem. What you may find as educational, someone else may not find educational. As far as trying to tie it to some class, the 3-hour semester course you're taking, can we draw a straight line? I think that's ridiculous of an argument. And it also talks about if the NCAA, I think, I'm trying to remember what their motto was as far as talking about 99 or something, the majority of these student athletes will go professional in something else.
Yeah.
Well, if that's truly what you believe in, realize that a lot of education comes outside the classroom, and I just think it's a faulty argument.
And let's remember, this is déjà vu. In the mid-1970s, this is exactly the argument they were having with the Olympic athletes, that if they earn money on the outside, they had to put it in a trust fund, and it can only be used for your training. There was this tethering to something. And that was just blown out of the water. We can't revisit what we decided 50 years ago works. These were the same arguments you're hearing from, the sky is going to fall if they get their NILs. This is exactly what we heard with our Olympic athlete amateur status rules. So getting rid of them is nothing new.
99% of these student athletes will never receive a single dollar from a professional sports contract or sports organization. So this is where I have a 180-degree difference viewpoint on some of the leadership that talked earlier today, talking about this is for the 1%. It's the exact opposite. This is for the 99%. These 1%, the Zion Williamsons, they're going to be just fine. But the 99% who want to have access back in their hometown to the backup quarterback at North Carolina A&T, a university to represent there in Greensboro, North Carolina, if he wants to go to his hometown and market his ability at a restaurant or something and get a couple $100s for signing autographs, he ought to damn well be able to have that opportunity. But the fact that the NCAA says no, young man or young woman, whether you're on a volleyball court or whatever, you can't do that. We know you're spending 50 hours in the gymnasium, on a volleyball team or a softball team, young lady, or on the athletic field. But to say even those 99% cannot even do any, when every other student, scholarship or not, has access to, it's a travesty, and I think it should be resolved certainly sooner than later.
Yeah, let's go to a couple of questions.
Well, today we're discussing name, image, and likeness. A parallel conversation is working its way through the halls of government around sports gambling. Will student athletes who don't feel they're being fairly compensated turn to things like match fixing? How should student athletes be educated or insulated from such situations?
Senator Blumenthal is working on this right now with another group. We have to come up with a federal law that addresses high school, amateur sport, and college gambling and a prohibition of it, but simultaneously, when we talk about these outside agencies that need to be established, if we're going to get ahead of the gambling game, there has to be an gambling anti-corruption center, not a federal agency, set up so that when you prohibit gambling on college sports or prohibit gambling on high school sports, here's your most vulnerable, lowly paid athlete who is going to be a prime target for match fixing. There is a way that we can have an anti-corruption agency that can identify where those matches are fixed, that has a primary responsibility for educating athletes as to how they can identify when they're being approached. There are solutions to that, and there are people in Congress who are, I think, engaged in the right course of action.
And I would say as well, so at the state level, in Michigan, we actually passed gaming legislation to allow for sports gaming. So I think even more so at the federal level, I think at the state level, we're going to have to address this issue sooner than later in terms of what is that going to look like moving forward. So.
The NCAA is besieged by legislation and potentially suffers a death of 1,000 antitrust litigation cuts. What are your thoughts on granting the NCAA an antitrust exemption if conditioned upon reforms monitored by Congress?
Show me the action first. I think one of the things that Jay Billis told me 2 years ago when I first met in his law offices, and we've dug this thing out for more than 2 years now, he said the NCAA will talk a good game about getting something done, but it's very rare that they act. So if you want to operate under good faith, I think, which is the premise of your question, then show us the model or the framework, as opposed to throwing it back off on like they have so far on the different divisions and say, well, tell us what you think, or come up with your solution, and then we can all get to talk. And if you look at the fine print, the way they word this, as long as it fits in the boundaries of what we believe is acceptable for the student athlete, well, that's all kind of gobbledygook gray language. So from my perspective, and the way that I'm looking at this from a federal legislator, is if they're willing to put some things in writing, so this is our intent, this is the timeline, so basically this is the how and the when, then yes, we can look at that, but I think it's their first move.
I couldn't agree more with that. If the NCAA wants a very limited antitrust exemption to cap the costs of intercollegiate athletics, to allow them to address coaches' salaries, to allow them to prohibit the building of lavish facilities, to bring college sports back into an educational model, I think that's what you're talking about, Congressman, in this case. And in the same way, in NILs, if we need a limited antitrust exemption to allow this independent oversight agency to set some marketplace values, to have a ceiling cap that will allow state not competition, that will remove the ability of one state, a major metro area, offering more money, for instance, to an athlete in major metro, to allow everybody across the country to go up to that ceiling. I think that kind of a leveling force, which would benefit athletes, a national average marketplace value, a lot like the Copyright Tribunal action, that kind of stuff might be deserving of a limited antitrust exemption for that independent agency that isn't run by the NCAA.
All right, so one couple real quick questions from y'all, and then we're going to wrap up. Number one, so Congressman, I saw you're not going to be running for office again in 2020. So what happens to this bill if you are now stepping out of the way?
Well, we've got to get it done in the next year. Our term doesn't end in January 2021. And not to give a commercial here, we're then looking at running for U.S. Senate. There'll be an open Senate seat in North Carolina. So, and I had to remind Mr. Emmert and our two senators that legislation starts in the House, not in the Senate. So, so maybe we'll get it done here, run for Senate, make sure it gets done across the way. But whatever it takes. In my closing comment on this, in the research that we've discovered, 40 to 45% of the student athletes that play in or participate in the money-making sports, if you will, come from impoverished communities, come from our urban areas. And that is something that I wish the NCAA would have an honest conversation about. They're not wanting to do that, but that's an important factor in why having access to your name, image, and likeness is so important.
Mm-hmm. Donna, you would have thought?
Yeah, just one more comment. Donna Shalala would have liked to be here. And obviously a Rules Committee meeting on impeachment tomorrow is a little more important. But she wanted me to be able to express to you that she intends to file this week a bill that would establish a 2-year congressional advisory commission to look at reform in intercollegiate athletics across the board. NILs are tip of the iceberg. We need to do that right away. It is not an excuse. In fact, she is very much in favor of getting this NIL bill absolutely passed and not to have the commission bill stall this baby out. But there has to be a serious look at the failure of the NCAA to govern, and who are they putting at risk are our college athletes. We've got to do a better job of that.
So we have the Shalala bill, we have the Mark Walker effort, we have the Knight Commission, we have a lot of pressure points on the NCAA. My final question before we go here. 3 years from now, You know, the NCAA has been on a long winning streak and kind of holding its model together. How do you handicap the ability of the model to preserve itself, fundamentally speaking, 3 years from now?
In 2023, Congress will pass an Intercollegiate Athletics Reform Act similar to what was passed in the 1970s, the Amateur Sports Act of 1978, that will produce an indelible change in the nature of the NCAA.
Mark?
It will get done long before that, because finally the exposure or the light has been put on Mr. Emmert and the NCAA. People are finally understanding the issue that this isn't about pay to play. This is just about justice and having rights like every other American.
And I'd like to actually sort of twist it a little bit. And it's less about your prediction about what's going to happen as a state legislator and more of a prediction about how the voters in your district will feel about a new model coming into place by 2023.
I think they will be extremely supportive. I think that there will be changes to the model, but not to the spirit of what intercollegiate athletics is. And I think that's what people want to keep intact. This is just making it better.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, I think we can all agree there's an awful lot to like about college sports.
Well said.
We all believe in sport as a tool of development in this country. So let's hope with over the next few years we can figure this out. Thank you to the panelists, and thank you to you, everyone, for coming.
Thanks for all you're doing. Really, really.
As good as anybody.
I would also like to thank again the Washington Post. I can't find the clicker. Is the clicker, John, around here? Is the clicker here? I'd like to thank the Washington Post for its support of the for the event. Also to our team, especially John Solomon, for bringing it together. Today's event is available on replay at the following URL. Our next Future of Sports event we're announcing here today will be March 27th on the Future of Sports. Donna will like this, if designed by women. So check it out. Thank you so much for coming, everyone. And you'll receive a survey afterward. Please vote in it. We're hitting all your